Patrick, a sinner, unlettered, the least of all the faithful, and held in contempt by a great many people. I am the son of Calpurnius, a deacon, son of Potitius, a priest. My father lived at the village of Banavam Taburnie, for he had an estate nearby, where I was taken captive. I was then about 16 years old. I did not know the true God, and for this reason I was led in captivity to Ireland with so many thousands of people.
The faith of this country in Ireland has to be reckoned with. What people have gone through over the centuries to promote, to keep, to evangelize the faith is amazing. The monks, the monasteries, the abbeys, the lack of food, the cold, like all this just so that they can keep this fire of the faith alive in them and bring it to other people. The penal laws, like what people went to celebrate Mass is ridiculous. Like going out in the middle of the woods in the pouring rain with your family, knowing that someone could kill you at any moment. The famine, the great starvation, people being offered food when that's the only thing that you can think about. But at the same time, if you have to give up your faith, you're not going to go for it, and they wouldn't go for it, and they'd give it up, and they'd end up dying. Like, this is all the fire that St. Patrick lit in the 5th century. This is the faith that he brought here, and it has not gone out. The problem is it's dwindling, and it's been covered in ashes. And what we have to do now, and what my hope is here as a missionary, is to get everybody to go back and learn their roots, to see what their ancestors did and why they did it, and ask yourself, what's the difference between them and me? Hopefully it's not indifference, and hopefully this helps you to rekindle the faith in Ireland. I guess you would have to start with a figure, a kingly figure, Niall of the Nine Hostages, as his name, or his last name states. He was one that liked to pirate, pillage, and get hostages. And one of the most famous hostages that we know of that he would have captured would have been Patrick. Patrick would have been from a Roman background, as far as we know, from Wales, or at least from Western Britain. And he was brought over at the age of about 16 to become a slave in what was known as Hibernium, like this winter place where not even the Romans wanted to come in just because it was cold and it wasn't really that appealing of a place to conquer. So he did about 6 years as a slave, shepherding, and in one moment he felt an inspiration in his heart that he was going to be freed from that. So in these 6 years, St. Patrick said his two best friends were hunger and nakedness. 6 years of hunger and nakedness, beatings, the life of a slave, I believe, forged Patrick, because he also puts in his confessions that in those years when he was on this lonely hill with nobody to talk to, he started developing an interior spiritual life. He would have been Christian, he would have been baptized, but it was starting to come alive now. When he felt like he was alone, he was abandoned, he was unloved, he started forming a relationship with God. And to the point where he heard a voice in his head saying that your hunger will be satiated and you will be tired no more because your ship awaits for you. And he feels like that's an inspiration, an impulse to get up and leave. Walks about 200 miles to a port. The sailors and the captain won't let him on because it's too dangerous to have a stowaway slave on your ship. He starts walking away, and miraculously they come up to him and they say, "You can come with us." He comes with them. Very hard journey. They make it to what we think was France. They had a shipload of Irish wolfhounds, which was a very important product in that day. They find a deserted land, all desert. So that's also signs that it was probably a barbarian invasion that had just happened there and just wiped out everything. They're wandering for about 2 weeks, no food. They feel like they're gonna die. The captain goes to him and says, "If you're a man of God like you say you are, how come he doesn't come and save us right now?" Patrick throws up a prayer to his God. He has full trust in him, and God provides. He sends a herd of pigs there, and it's just a sign of Patrick's closeness to God. He enters what would have been seminary to get formation to become a priest, and soon becomes a bishop. And he feels another call in his heart, another vision. This time is coming from the same people who kidnapped him and treated him as a slave, the Irish, saying, "Patrick, come back and walk amongst us." He feels an impulse, I have to go back to the people. He goes back to them and he becomes their bishop. He becomes Patrick of Ireland, taking on the Druids, taking on all these pagan human sacrifices, everything that was going on in Ireland, and he transforms the country without bloodshed.
We're in Downpatrick. We're right beside the grave which has some of the relics of St. Patrick. He was sold as a slave to work here, not far from here, about 40 miles from here. And it was his purification, it was his desert experience. He tells us in his confessions, I got to know God. I prayed to God 100 times during the day and as many more during the night, and God came to me and he comforted me as a father comforts his son. Why was Patrick's mission successful? Because later on, when he went back to Britain and the angel of Ireland appeared to him, come, holy youth, and walk among us once more, his mission was successful because he knew the culture. He knew the pagan traditions that had to be penetrated by the gospel, but he also knew the Irish language. So when he arrived not far from here, he was able to say to Dechu, the chieftain, Giadich, that was God be with you, which is the traditional Irish greeting. And Dechu would have looked around at his family and said, who is this man that he knows our language? And so that really endeared him to Dechu, and Dechu and his family became the first of his converts, where he said his first mass. His mission flourished because he was truly enculturated. So here we are in Saul, about 3 miles outside Downpatrick, and I'm standing on the oldest Christian foundation in Ireland. This is the place where Patrick came in 432. He landed in Strangford Lough, about less than a mile from here. So Saul is the Irish for Saul. Saul means barn, and it's true that the first mass that was celebrated here was celebrated in a barn, which Dechu gave to Patrick. Tradition has it that one of his disciples, who's also known as a saint, Saint Tassach, gave him extreme unction. He gave him Holy Communion on his deathbed. But when Patrick was buried here, he would have been buried in the middle of what was then an abbey. He did form a group of monks here, and when the Vikings would have raided this place, his body would have been taken and laid where the cathedral is in Downpatrick. But we're very sure that Patrick was here because there's a little place in the middle where it looks like a special little house where his body was housed, literally, and people would have venerated it, and people love to be buried beside a saint.
So we're in the ruins of an old Franciscan college on the hill of Slane, which would be right next to one of the first monasteries founded here in Ireland by a convert of St. Patrick. This guy, Eric, if you want in English, he would have been one of the cohorts of King Lear, who was the High King of Ireland at the time, and his high throne would have been on the Hill of Tara, which is about 15 miles from here. And they came over here to Slane because Patrick had disobediently lit a fire. So when you're inaugurating these pagan festivals, only one fire had to be lit and no other fires could be lit, and that fire had to be the start of the other ones. It was very important. And that fire started in the Hill of Ward, which was right on the outsides of Trim. And so that would have been a hubbub, an administration of all the Druids and the pagan deity workers, and they had to light the first fire on the Hill of Ward, and then they would bring it to Tara, where the High King had his throne. St. Patrick knew that, but he defies the king, and it's an apostolic moment where he's saying, the king's like, no one lights the fire has to come from the Hill of Tara, and that's going to mark our pagan festivities. And all of a sudden he sees there's a fire being lit in the Hill of Slane. They go to put it out, they meet with Patrick, and that's one of the important moments where Patrick converts him. And one of his cronies of King Lear, he says to him, he says, you better put this fire out now, because if you don't put it out, no one's ever going to put it out. When he lit the fire, when he defied the authorities, when he said that this is the light of Christ, it's going to come into this country, it didn't go out. And to this day, that fire is still going. The issue is that we have to rekindle it by kind of digging back, going back to the roots and seeing what is this fire and what importance does it have for me in my life.
God brought to bear upon us the wrath of his anger, and scattered us among many peoples, even to the uttermost part of the earth, where now, in my lowliness, I dwell among strangers. and there the Lord opened my unbelieving mind, so that even at that late hour I should remember my sins, and turn with all my heart to the Lord my God, who looked upon my abjection and had mercy on my youth and ignorance, and watched over me before I knew him, and before I came to be wise, or to discern between good and evil. And he kept me safe, and comforted me as a father would his son. And that then is why I cannot remain silent, nor is it expedient that I should, about such great favours and so great a grace as the Lord deigned to bestow on me in the land of my captivity.
Going back to Niall of the Nine Hostages, one of his great-great-grandsons would have been St. Columba. He should have been a king. He should have been also following in his great-great-grandfather's footsteps, but he ended up becoming also a monk and a missionary, founding monasteries around Ireland.
So here you have a place again named after Columba, Dura, Columcilla, Dura meaning oak, Colum meaning dove, Killa meaning church. So this is known as the oak grove of the dove of the church. The name Dove is very important in Columba's life because it really emanates from his love of the Eucharist. Columba, as a young child, has royal blood in a sense that he's destined to be a High King of Ireland.
Who gave in his right to become king, gave in everything, and he became a very holy monk. He was the first missionary to leave Ireland.
So Columba initially, before going to Iona, had settled further south, but he could see Ireland from there, and that's why he moved further north to Iona. And from there, through that monastic settlement, he set about the Christianization of the Picts of Alba. Columba is probably the first Irish saint to evangelize outside of Ireland. So Patrick comes to Ireland, converting the High Kings, really brings the church alive. Then Ireland then becomes quiet for maybe 100 years or so, that actually establishes the monastic settlements. So you see here now the link now even Columba with St. Kieran. St. Kieran would have been a pupil of St. Columba. Kieran then, after leaving Clonard, sets up the monastic settlement of Clonmacnoise.
So when you hear that Ireland was, the land of saints and scholars, it's something that is like really typical. It's basically going back to these monks. So these monks would have drank from the spirit of St. Patrick, this ascetic, warrior type bishop monk, and they would have assimilated that spirit and spread it everywhere. So this is the old ruins of what would have been a monastery here in Clonmacnoise, County Offaly. This is the monastery that St. Kieran founded. So he was one of the 12 disciples of St. Columba. He would have come from Clonard, which was a massive monastery in his time of monks. They said there was about 3,000 of them there. And he came here and founded this monastery, which was basically a place where they would preserve Western civilization in a nutshell, like all the culture and richness that was getting burned and destroyed on the mainland was getting stowed away and brought here, and the monks were copying it into books so that we could actually have it to this day. That's due to them. And also the spirit of prayer and asceticism. That's something that was very strong in the lives of these monks and is what held this country, fueled its faith, and kept this fire burning. The Roman Empire, the greatest empire probably that we know, did not extend here into Ireland because for the Romans this place was frankly too cold. It was just like a big winter, not so wonderful land, and they didn't make it in here. But it would end up being conquered by the Roman language, the Roman Catholic Church, the faith. And funny enough, when Rome itself was being sacked, pillaged, destroyed by the barbarian invasions, Ireland preserved all of Western culture. Like these books, these writings, poetry, famous literature that we enjoy now and that we've been formed, like all of our Western culture, is due to these monks who would have been writing down meticulously, copying and preserving and safeguarding all of these works. A lot has to be said too, because we're right now in this Benedictine Abbey. It's called Hoare Abbey and it's in Cashel. But funny enough, the Benedictines were only here for 5 years. This is the early 13th century. because the archbishop had a dream that the Benedictines were going to kill him. So he threw him out of this abbey, and he put in a Cistercian order. But the Benedictine rule, and this is very important, especially for like uncivilized peoples, when the Benedictines would come in, they would teach them simple work and prayer. So like in Germany, for example, you have these barbarians, but all of a sudden a barbarian learns the life of work and prayer and dedication, and you have German efficiency, like thanks to the Benedictines. So this would have been a Benedictine abbey, although shortly lived, and it's a life of dedication to work, prayer, and simplicity, and that's what preserves and keeps culture going. Like you have the monks also in Skellig Michael, you know, they see this mountain in the middle of the water and they say, this is the ends of the earth. You can't get further west than this. We're going there. And from there, we're going to ward off any evil through our prayers and through our sacrifices, like kind of like just throwing them into the darkness so that evil doesn't come onto the mainland. And we're also going to sacrifice our lives in prayer to keep the faith alive on the mainland. And St. John Paul II, when he came to Ireland, this is one of the spots he visited. It was an offshoot visit. It's an Anglican site. And it wasn't really part of the plan, but he came here and he wept, and they asked him afterwards what the deal was, like why, first of all, he came and why did he weep? And he said it was the monks from here, Clonmacnoise, that evangelized Poland. So it just goes to show how far these guys got. Their spirit was unbelievable. We're in Glendalough, County Wicklow, in the Leinster province here in Ireland. And we're here to see St. Kevin and the monastic city of Glendalough. St. Kevin, we think, is the answer to St. Patrick's prayers or his prophecy that an apostle, a missionary, would arise for this province south of Dublin. And he did. He was a missionary. And all these monks that were here were as well, even though they were monks, hermits, living a life of asceticism. So like I said, it's cold here. The sun shines probably like a month and a half out of the year. So they're used to just like darkness, rain, and kind of like a dreary weather. They didn't come here for that. They're missionaries because through their prayers and through their sacrifices and through this ascetic lifestyle, they're evangelizing. They're bringing spiritual fire to people whose lives would be probably put out, who wouldn't have that. The graves and the bell tower also are calling towards our missionary purpose. Our missionary purpose is to help people die well, and to die well you have to live well. And to live well you have to hear the voice of Christ, which is symbolized in the bell, which would have rang probably 3 times a day to remind the monks and to remind people to pray the Angelus, to think of the most important mystery that happened, the incarnation of the Son of God. And the second thing we have here is one of the oldest cathedrals in Ireland that we know of. The thing about this cathedral is that here at the end, the opening is facing the east. That is everything. That is the answer to everything, because St. Patrick came to Ireland to bring a person to a people. His whole purpose here in this country was to orient them. That's what the east means. It means the orient. And orientation means to turn people from one lifestyle to another. So you're facing the west, you turn around through a conversion and you start facing the east. What's the east? The east is the resurrection. It's the light, it's the warmth, it's Jesus Christ. So St. Patrick, St. Kevin, and all the Irish missionaries had one purpose here, and that was to orient people. It was to put a face to a desire, because there is a desire in this people. When they got here, you could have seen a people that was in love with nature, in love with, the energy that you receive from creation. Like a lot of New Age stuff isn't that new, it's pretty old. But it's not to be found in creation. I'm not going to get this energy and this purpose and this sense of my life from creation. It can help me bring me to the Creator, but it's not there. You're seeking the right thing. You're seeking fulfillment, you're seeking joy, you're seeking peace, but you're seeking it in a place where you're not going to get it. So what do I do as a missionary? I come here and I put it down loud and clear. Jesus Christ is the answer to everything you're looking for. I will go through any temperature, I'll go through any hunger, I'll go through anything and everything to bring people to where they have to be facing. That's the east, to orient them, to put a face to all the desires, all the needs that they want. And that face is Jesus Christ, the God incarnate.
Because this is the return we can make after God corrects us and brings us to know him, to exalt and praise his wondrous deeds before every nation under the whole heaven. And because there is no other God, nor was there ever before, nor will there be hereafter, except God the Father, unbegotten, without beginning, from whom is all beginning, containing all things, as we have been taught, and his Son Jesus Christ, whom we declare to have been always with the Father, before the beginning of the world, begotten of the Father, after the manner of Spirit, inexpressibly, and through him were made all things, visible and invisible. He was made man. And having conquered death, he was received into heaven, into the presence of the Father. And he gave him all power, above every name in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, and let every tongue confess to him that Jesus Christ is Lord and God, in whom we believe, and whose coming we look for soon, to be judge of the living and the dead, and to render to everyone according to his deeds.
So this faith, this fire has been fought and has been preserved and has been in jeopardy. So it's a country that's also been suffering a lot. This country has suffered so much persecution. If you go to the times of the Protestant Reformation,
You simply cannot hope to understand Ireland without the Reformation. The Reformation is one of those seismic events. Obviously has effects far beyond Ireland, which was really a backwater. But if you're studying Irish history, you certainly can't make head or tail of it after the 16th century without taking that into account constantly.
we're here in Drogheda. It's a coastal town north of Dublin. This place would have been sacked and decimated, and there would have been a massive massacre here when Cromwell started his campaign 1649. So he gets to this city and he's infuriated because he sees casualties, and he says, no quarter. That means no prisoners, no mercy. Everybody is going to be basically slaughtered. So Oliver Plunkett had a very prestigious, I would say comfortable career ahead of him. So he left Ireland to become a priest in Italy. He had, like I said, a lot of potential. But they asked him to come back to Ireland and be the Bishop of Armagh. He says yes. Like a lot of priests who are abroad, Irish priests, they said yes to come back and minister to their homeland because there was no sacraments, there was nothing going on here, it was prohibited. So they knew if they came back here, it could be imminent death. That's why in some of the villages where they would stop by before coming back to Ireland, the villagers would ask to kiss their hands or for their blessing, because they knew that these priests, through their complete self-giving and their selfless love, they're going to be martyred as they get back here. So they'd ask for their blessing, the martyr's blessing before he dies, and they would make it back here. So he's thrown in jail in Dublin. Later they bring him to London, where he's put into a prison. Brutal conditions, absolutely atrocious, you know, for a guy with his feeble health and everything. He lives through it. They finally condemn him to death, so they drag him on what was called a sledge. It was just like a big gate that you put you on, and they would drag him for like a couple kilometers. That would allow people to like spit on him, say whatever they wanted, slap him in the face. This humiliating scene of this archbishop laying down on this door, it's just like the symbol of him like laying down his life. He knew that this was going to happen to him, but it didn't stop him. He went through with it, and the worst was that they ended up hanging, drawing, and quartering him.
And the penal laws, where really you were under huge restrictions if you were a Catholic, you know, in terms of the ownership of property, in terms of the entry into the professions, in terms of sitting in Parliament. These things were all open to you, provided that you took the requisite oath and you accommodated yourself to the Church of Ireland, which was a branch of the Anglican Communion, and Irish Catholics couldn't do that, wouldn't do it.
Be a Catholic in this country basically meant that you were just basically signing off all of your rights, even human rights. You could kill a Catholic and nothing would happen. You had no real price on your life. You were basically slaves. Land slowly started becoming more into the English power until they got to the point where 95% of the land here in this country was in the hands of English landlords. But that didn't stop the Irish from preserving and keeping what was most precious to them. If you're a priest, you leave the country. If you don't leave the country within a certain amount of days, we're going to kill you, and there's going to be a bounty on your head, so people are going to basically turn you in. And if you're a bishop, even more bounty on your head. It didn't stop them. And even with these penal laws, you couldn't celebrate Mass. What'd they do? You're getting families getting up in the middle of the night, going out into the middle of the woods, terrible weather, to find a rock to celebrate Mass, which could have been like 2 to 3 hours long, risking their lives, because if someone comes, there's a bounty on the priest's head, and you also could be killed. Your tongue and your ears could be cut off if you didn't confess where the priest was. And they continued to do it. They would not give up the Mass.
It's a hard history. I don't think you can understand a people without understanding something of the topography that they live in, the climate, what kind of land it is, how easy it is to make a living there, and how a living is made. I think that's obvious. You know, I think it's obvious. I think it's when you understand that Catholicism in Ireland became really very much a peasant religion. How would you put it? Perhaps the peasant is stolid. The peasant has a tremendous capacity for suffering. The peasant is shrewd, tremendous judge of character, because he cannot afford mistakes. He cannot be cheated. And the peasant is perhaps unimaginative and ruthless. They had wonderful strengths, and they had wonderful weaknesses. You know, and you can't understand Irish Catholicism without that category.
The Great Famine hits, 5 years where this country went from 8 million people to 4. The ablaze hit the potato, and it was the food of the peasant. And the peasant, you really had nothing. The potato was the only crop. That fails, and you're not getting any food off these lords either. In fact, a lot of this food was getting shipped out of Ireland and going off into the mainland. So there was food, but it wasn't getting distributed. 5 years of people, just absolute massacre of death.
You had just an absolute disaster. You had an absolute catastrophe. It was like a fire in a hayshed. Population swollen to 8 million, most of them poor, most of them landless, most of them dependent on one crop, because the potato grew plentifully, easily in the Irish climate and was nourishing. They grow the potato, they'd sell the good ones to make the money for the rent of their little field, and they'd live on the rest.
There's cases also when they were offered soup, they were offered anything really of substance, but if they changed their faith and they came over to the Protestants, and they said no, they would rather die of hunger than trade in their faith for a bowl of soup, and they did it. There's one case of a girl in Kilkenny where one of the English lords offered her sexual favors, and he wanted to get favors in exchange, obviously, and she said, I would rather lose my life and the life of my parents than lose my virtue that I have gained in the faith of my fathers, and she died. She ended up dying.
Toughest things a believer has to come to terms with would be familiar to Job, is that you can follow God devoutly and have a rotten life. Everything goes wrong for you. And you can starve to death on the side of a road in the rain in Ireland because you won't change your faith. This is the same God who watched his son crucified. It really is a mistake to underestimate how strong his stomach is. Irish Catholics suffered, I was going to call it a terrible reverse. It was an outright catastrophe of seismic proportions in the mid-19th century. And their faith did them no good, and yet for the most part they stuck by their faith. For the most part, they stayed with their faith. Clearly what was in it was profoundly nourishing.
20 years after the famine, an extremely important event happens. This is also very symbolic of what this country is, the Mass and our Blessed Mother. People are in desolation, cold, dark Ireland, hunger, it's all there, and who appears? Our Blessed Mother to comfort them. In 1879, in a very poor and humble area of County Mayo, Archdeacon Kavanagh found himself at a complete loss because he was administering up to 40 to 60 anointing of the sick on a daily basis. The people were dying and he couldn't keep up with it. It was a mini famine that was going on in this little town here in Ireland. This was about 40 years after the Great Famine. And he made a deal with our Blessed Mother. He said that he was going to offer up 100 consecutive masses for all the deceased and all the people that were dying in his parish. And on the 100th day, she personally came down from heaven to thank him. There were many witnesses, over a dozen here in Knock, that saw our Blessed Mother appear. It was a bright light that shone on the gable end of the parish church. And the humble, poor peasant people of the village gave testimony that over 2 hours of apparition was going on. Our Blessed Mother had her hands in prayer, and she was looking up to heaven. St. Joseph and St. John were at her side. St. John was teaching from the Word of God. He was in the posture of teaching. And as far as I'm concerned, the most important element of this Marian apparition was the altar and the Lamb of God that was on it, the cross behind it. And they all give testimony to seeing this vision. 2 of them go to his house because they're saying, where's Father Kavanaugh? How come he's not here, the parish priest? They don't go into his house because they see a light coming out from under the door, and they have the conviction that he's seen the same thing as them. Our Blessed Mother coming down and thanking him for his masses, showing them also through her silence, because in Knock she didn't say a word, showing them in her silence that they're going down the right path, that they live and they die for the Holy Mass. They never give up the Eucharist. They could lose their food, they could lose their house, they could lose everything, they could be in the worst conditions, but if they have loyalty to the Eucharist and if they have the Mass, they have absolutely everything, because it's the Lamb of God at the end of the day that takes away our sins and that gives us life. And our Blessed Mother, she appears as queen. They see her crowned, a people who have suffered under queens and kings from the mainland who putting down these laws and basically taking away everything they've had, and she's coming and saying, I'm your queen. And you continue to serve me praying the rosary, because it's the rosary that kept them, really. The faith of the Irish people in the rosary is unbelievable. Cromwell himself said it. He wrote back to England. He said, you've given us arms, you've given us money, but we can't take away these damn beads. That's what he said. It's the contextual words. And you see the Irish shaking the beads of the cannons before they're shot. It's the rosary that they held on to, and they never gave it up, and they kept praying it. It's almost like Our Lady Knock is saying, keep it up. Devotion to me and devotion to the Eucharist. These are the 2 pillars that this country has always stood on. And this is what St. Patrick lit when he came here in the 5th century. This is the fire, and it hasn't gone out. When this fire of the faith gets a hold of the Irish, there is no putting it out. There's no stopping it. And you know this is going to happen to you. You know that you're going to meet this end. Like through the penal laws, through all the persecution, the people knew what was going to happen to them if they held on to their faith. In a lot of situations, it was very easy to give the faith up. There were so many offers for them, but they didn't do it. They went through it from the beginning, the middle, and the end, and God rewards them.
There was clearly something in that faith that was not superficial. It was profoundly nourishing. It was a more than adequate explanation to those shrewd and tough people of the whole world and their place in it, and they would not give it up. You give people the truth, it's very hard to prize it out of their paws later. You know? You should have thought of that before you gave it to them. Clearly, they had what they believed, what I believe, to be the truth. And they weren't giving it up for anything.
So the blood of our martyrs, the blood of Oliver Plunkett, right now we are seeing seeds, we are seeing fruits that are being born. So we have to look to these guys and we have to say, what is it that was in them that was pushing them to these extremes that maybe I don't have, and maybe I have to look into getting them.
I am greatly God's debtor, because he granted me so much grace that through me many people would be reborn in God, and soon after confirmed, and that clergy would be ordained everywhere for them, the masses lately come to belief, whom the Lord drew from the ends of the earth, just as he once promised through his prophets. To you shall the nations come from the ends of the earth, and shall say, our fathers have inherited naught but lies, worthless things in which there is no profit. So, how is it that in Ireland, where they never had any knowledge of God, but always until now cherished idols and unclean things, they are lately become a people of the Lord, and are called children of God, the sons of the Irish, and the daughters of the chieftains are to be seen as monks and virgins of Christ?